We are focusing today on a case that is both profoundly tragic and just relentlessly contested in legal circles. It's the death of 70-year-old Adrianna Hutto in Esto, Florida, and the immediate legal firestorm that resulted in the conviction of her mother, Amanda Lewis.
It's a case that requires us to handle the facts with a great deal of seriousness. Anytime you're dealing with the loss of a child's life, the gravity of what happened has to be front and center.
Absolutely, and that's our purpose here today with this analysis. We want to examine the source materials, the articles, the court documents, investigative notes that detail the entire story, from the initial police inquiry to the highly publicized trial in 2008, and critically, the very recent and ongoing efforts to challenge the integrity of that conviction.
And that scrutiny of the conviction has been immense, especially lately. Our job is to really lay out the information from all these sources for you, the listener, so you can understand every facet.
So let's establish the core timeline first. Adrianna Hutto, who was born in September of 1999, died on August 8, 2007. The initial narrative is heartbreakingly simple. She was found unresponsive in her family's above-ground swimming pool.
Right. And her mother, Amanda Lewis, she insisted it was a horrific, sudden accident.
But that's not where the story ended. Within just a few months, Lewis was arrested, she was charged, and in 2008, sentenced to life in prison without parole for first-degree murder.
And that abrupt transition from what was first classified as a potential accident to a swift, high-stakes homicide conviction, that's exactly what makes this case so legally fascinating and, so publicly controversial. There's a mountain of information to get through.
And our objective is to pull out the most important knowledge for you. We wanted to find where the facts seemed to be indisputable and where the evidence itself became the pivot point for all the legal disputes that followed.
And that pivot point, the thing that turned this whole case on its head, was a single crucial element.
It was the testimony of a child, Adrianna's half-brother, AJ, who was only 6 years old at the time of the incident.
That's right. Without his statement, this case, well, it likely would have concluded as a tragic accident. With it, the prosecution moved forward with the highest possible charge. It all hinged on him.
That young boy's testimony is the thread we have to follow. But before we get there, we really need to ground ourselves in the immediate moments after the event. Let's look at the earliest moments documented in the source material. We're talking about August 8, 2007. The first official record we have is Amanda Lewis's 911 call.
In that call, Lewis is frantic. She claims she found her daughter, Adrianna, in the pool and that she wasn't breathing. The sources all indicate she presented as a panicked mother, which triggered an immediate emergency response.
And the sources also indicate she acted quickly. We know she was administering CPR to Adrianna before the police and paramedics even arrived on the scene.
That's a vital piece of context, isn't it? Her actions, trying to resuscitate her own child, they appear, at least on the surface, completely consistent with a parent who's just found themselves in the middle of a horrible accident.
It is crucial context. Adrianna was then rushed to Bay Medical Hospital. But despite all the efforts, she was pronounced dead about an hour after her arrival.
And initially, the death was handled and classified by the Jackson County Sheriff's Office as just that, an accidental drowning.
But the clock on that classification was ticking. The investigation stayed open, which is standard practice. But about a month later, everything changed. This led to Lewis's arrest in September 2007. She was charged with first-degree murder.
And the crucial development was, as you mentioned, the statement from Adrianna's 6-year-old half-brother, AJ. He was interviewed by police, and his statement completely contradicted his mother's account of an accident.
And AJ's allegation was specific and, shocking. It transformed the police's perspective entirely. He claimed that his mother had dunked Adrianna in the pool as a form of corporal punishment.
That single word, dunked, it altered the entire investigation. It supplied the element of intent, of force, that was required to reclassify the death from an accident to intentional homicide, specifically to murder.
It's important to understand the full context the investigators were building during that month between the incident and the arrest, though. We know from the source material that Adrianna had been diagnosed with ADHD. This was part of the background information they were gathering about, the challenges inside the home.
Yes, and Lewis herself spoke about her relationship with her daughter. She admitted that she'd had some trouble bonding with Adrianna initially, but she claimed that her affection for her had grown over time. These personal dynamics were all being collected by the police to try and build a picture of that mother-child relationship.
And beyond the family dynamics, investigators started focusing on tangible details that might suggest deception or a pattern of, say, harsh parenting. One of the first things that drew their scrutiny was the apparent lack of toys in the house for either Adriana or AJ.
Right, and this is where police felt they spotted their first potential lie. When they asked her about the missing toys, Lewis gave an explanation. She said that the children's toys had been taken away for a week as a punishment for some misbehavior and that they were being stored in a shed on the property.
A straightforward explanation.
Hmm.
But when investigators executed a search warrant and physically went to that shed, they found no toys inside.
Exactly, and that discrepancy was powerful for the prosecution. It suggested Lewis was actively trying to deceive the police about the overall environment in the home, maybe hiding evidence of overly harsh conditions. And if she was lying about that, her credibility about the drowning itself was immediately undermined.
So they found no toys in the shed. But the sources do note a little red wagon and 2 inflatable pool toys were found in the yard.
Yes, they were.
Yeah.
Which adds another layer of complexity. It wasn't that there were 0 playthings on the property, just not where she said they'd be.
Now, this issue of AJ's testimony is so fascinating because the defense would later just zero in on the reliability of a 6-year-old witness. But before we even get to the trial, let's talk about AJ's shifting narrative. The sources indicate his story changed multiple times. How did the prosecution deal with that instability?
Well, the shifting accounts are a standard difficulty in any case that relies on a young witness. The sources don't detail every single version of AJ's story, but the legal challenge arose because AJ might have initially spoken about the event as, a tragic fall or an accident. The claim of his mother dunking Adrianna seems to have emerged later.
And that suggests the possibility of suggestive questioning by investigators.
That's what the defense argued. They were trying to piece together a narrative that contradicted Lewis's own 911 call. This process, the evolution from an accidental witness to the key accuser, is what the defense called into question. They argued that the final account was potentially tainted or even shaped by the investigators' own theories of the case.
It creates a powerful ambiguity, doesn't it? On one hand, you have a 6-year-old making this horrific claim that points directly to murder. But on the other, the inconsistency of that claim really undermines its integrity. It means the prosecution needed physical evidence to anchor AJ's testimony.
They absolutely did. But even before the physical evidence came into play, there was another strange point in the investigation. Amanda Lewis submitted to a polygraph test, a lie detector test, and she passed it, claiming she had not killed her daughter.
That's another major conflict in the narrative. Now, I know polygraph results are often inadmissible or at least treated with a lot of skepticism in court, but passing one certainly complicates the simple narrative of a guilty mother, at least in the public's eye.
It creates a point of doubt, for sure. And the investigation was also marked by some procedural issues that contributed to public confusion. Shortly after the incident, Sheriff Lee spoke with reporters, and he incorrectly stated that the police had found Adrianna in the overground pool.
Which we know is not true. The sources are very clear that Lewis had already pulled Adrianna from the pool and was trying CPR when the first responders arrived.
And that kind of misstatement, even if it's unintentional, it's significant. It immediately skews the public's perception of what happened. It minimizes Lewis's attempt to save her daughter and creates this false image that police arrived to find the child just abandoned in the water. All of these things, the shifting witness testimony, the deception about the toys, the physical location of the body, they all culminated in her arrest in September 2007.
And the stakes were immediately evident. Before the trial even began, Lewis was offered a plea bargain.
She was. A deal was put on the table. If she pleaded guilty to manslaughter, she would receive a 10-year sentence. And considering the alternative was a life sentence for murder, that was a major decision point for her.
But she declined the offer. She maintained her complete innocence.
Her decision to do that, to turn down a 10-year deal, it meant she was confident enough in the facts, or perhaps just resolute in her own belief of innocence, to risk spending the rest of her life in prison. And that move set the stage for what would become one of the most contentious and remarkably short murder trials in recent Florida history.
So Amanda Lewis went to trial in February 2008. The entire prosecution strategy, it seems, revolved around taking the statements of her 6-year-old son, AJ, and convincing a jury that they were reliable enough to prove homicide beyond a reasonable doubt.
That is the pivotal challenge in this case, isn't it? AJ's testimony, his statements about his mother dunking Adrianna, they were entered as the central piece of evidence that defined her intent. The question is, how did the prosecution successfully insulate that testimony from the defense's intense attacks on its reliability?
And the defense was relentless. They challenged AJ, noting that his story had changed several times during questioning sessions with law enforcement and with child services personnel. They argued that the boy was impressionable, and his narrative was potentially shaped or coerced by the very nature of those repeated interviews.
Well, the legal mechanism that allows a 6-year-old's changing account to sustain a murder charge often relies on the concept of corroboration. Prosecutors argued that while AJ might have been confused about, say, timing or some peripheral details, the core allegation that Lewis used the pool as a tool for punishment, that part remained consistent enough.
But the defense would counter, of course, that if the core facts themselves are manipulated or inconsistent, then the whole legal foundation for murder just disappears.
Exactly. So to combat that argument, the prosecution introduced physical evidence that they claimed supported AJ's testimony. Specifically, multiple bruises that were found on Adrianna's forehead.
And this was a critical tactical move for them. They needed to tie the emotional, potentially unreliable testimony of a child to some kind of hard physical fact. So the prosecution argued that those bruises were absolutely consistent with the forceful dunking that AJ described. They suggested Adrianna's head had violently hit the pool floor or the sides during this alleged punishment.
And the defense would have argued that those same bruises could have been consistent with an accidental drowning, perhaps the child falling or thrashing in the water, especially given that it was an above-ground pool. So the interpretation of that physical evidence becomes paramount.
It does, and that interpretation relied almost entirely on the medical professional who performed the autopsy. Beyond the direct evidence of the drowning, the court also heard testimony that painted a broader, unflattering picture of the home environment. They brought in statements from Lewis's co-workers about her behavior, evidence of what the sources call poor housekeeping, and of course the earlier testimony about the deception around the missing toys.
This kind of background evidence isn't about the act of drowning itself, but it's about establishing a context, suggesting a potentially neglectful, volatile environment where this kind of excessive punishment might be plausible. It's often called propensity evidence, used to suggest a pattern of behavior.
However, the truly catastrophic weakness at the heart of the prosecution's case, a weakness that's now being aggressively exploited by the post-conviction legal team, was the involvement of the medical examiner. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Charles Siebert.
And the significance of Dr. Siebert's role here, it really cannot be overstated. When a medical examiner is relieved of duty for negligence, that strikes at the very core of the prosecution's entire physical evidence foundation.
It has to. And Dr. Siebert had a documented and very public history of professional negligence. The sources detailed that he had previously been relieved of duty for negligence in no fewer than 36 previous cases. This wasn't a minor error. This was a documented systemic failure.
And the sources specifically name one of the most high-profile cases connected to his negligence, the death of Martin Anderson. The issues with Dr. Siebert centered around misclassifications of the cause and manner of death, often overlooking critical evidence or drawing conclusions that just weren't supported by the physical facts.
What happened in the Martin Anderson case?
That was the death of a boy in a juvenile boot camp. The initial autopsy findings by Siebert were so flawed that they actively obscured the true nature of the death, which complicated the legal fallout significantly. After that, Siebert had been reinstated at one point, but only under strict supervision, which suggests his professional reputation was already severely compromised.
And what about his status at the time of the Lewis trial in February 2008? Was he still under that supervision?
He was not. And this is crucial. Prior to Amanda Lewis's trial even starting, Dr. Siebert had been removed from duty yet again due to ongoing issues, and he had physically left the state of Florida entirely.
So let me get this straight. The medical examiner who classified Adrianna's death as a homicide, providing the necessary physical backing for AJ's testimony, had a history of severe, repeated professional misconduct and was deemed unfit to practice in the state at the very time of the trial.
That's it, exactly. It's a devastating piece of background information that the defense either, well, failed to fully exploit, or maybe the jury just failed to grasp its magnitude. It raises the distinct possibility that the classification of homicide and the interpretation of those bruises was based on an unreliable or at least a highly questionable medical opinion.
It fundamentally undermines the certainty that's required in a capital case, doesn't it? If the evidence of homicide itself is suspect, the conviction can't stand on solid ground.
It can't. And despite this critical weakness in the medical evidence, the trial moved incredibly quickly. It lasted only 4 days.
And even those 4 days had procedural disruptions.
They did. On the second day of the proceedings, 2 of the 6 impaneled jurors just failed to return to the courtroom. A murder trial has to proceed with a full panel, so this necessitated the immediate selection of substitutes and a rebriefing. That kind of interruption, while maybe necessary, it's a procedural hurdle that can disrupt the flow of evidence and potentially affect the jury's focus.
Following those 4 days of testimony, the jury found Amanda Lewis guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. And the speed of that decision is just remarkable.
The deliberation only took 2 hours, and that time included a break for lunch. For a first-degree murder case that hinged so heavily on circumstantial evidence, the credibility of a 6-year-old, and flawed medical testimony, such a rapid conviction suggests one of 2 things. Either the jury was just overwhelmingly convinced by the prosecution's simple narrative, or they failed to give sufficient time and weight to the defendant's arguments about the reliability of the evidence and the credibility of Dr. Siebert.
In March 2008, the sentence was delivered. Amanda Lewis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the conviction, Lewis's initial legal battles focused on the structure of the charges themselves. In 2010, she filed an appeal that centered on a complex legal concept known as the merger doctrine.
To really understand this, we need to quickly touch on the felony murder rule. Felony murder allows a prosecution to get a murder conviction without having to prove premeditation. They just have to prove that the death happened while the defendant was committing an underlying felony. In this case, that underlying felony was aggravated child abuse.
So if they proved she committed child abuse and Adrianna died during that act, they proved murder, even if Lewis didn't wake up that morning planning to kill her daughter.
Precisely. And Lewis's defense used the merger doctrine to argue against this. The doctrine says that if the underlying felony, the child abuse, is an integral part of the death, you can't use it to elevate the charge to felony murder. In layman's terms, they argued the abuse, the dunking, and the death were one single merged event.
And if the court had agreed that the abuse merged with the homicide, the felony murder charge would have been negated, right?
Yes, and that would have forced the prosecution to prove premeditated murder, that Lewis specifically intended to kill Adrianna, which is a much higher and more difficult burden of proof in these kinds of spontaneous acts of alleged punishment. Lewis's team hoped to reduce the conviction to a lower grade of homicide, like manslaughter.
But the appeal was unsuccessful.
It was. The conviction was affirmed. The Florida court system, like many others, tends to view child abuse as a distinct crime that can indeed serve as the underlying felony.
But despite that affirmation, this case has consistently remained in the public eye. The fact that major investigative media outlets keep returning to this conviction tells you there's a persistent public and journalistic doubt about its finality.
Absolutely. We saw the case featured on Investigation Discovery's True Crime with Aphrodite Jones. It was also the subject of a high-profile 2020 episode, which really focused on the central issue. It was titled, What AJ Saw, Mother's Fate Hinged on 7-Year-Old's Testimony.
Even the UK documentary series Killer Women with Piers Morgan covered the case.
It really speaks to the ongoing skepticism around a conviction based so heavily on a young, changing testimony and what we now know was questionable medical evidence. And that media interest has only intensified recently, leading directly to formal legal action.
This raises an important question, then, about the modern influence of independent investigative analysis on the judicial system. We've seen intense scrutiny applied by recent media, specifically noting the award-winning In Esto, What Really Happened to Adrianna Hutto investigative series, which launched in 2024.
And that momentum was built upon. The Undisclosed podcast, which is a very well-known voice in reviewing controversial convictions, they also released an extensive 11-episode series about this in 2025. This combined focus seems to have been the direct catalyst for a renewed legal effort.
It appears their independent investigations either uncovered or at least highlighted what Lewis's current legal team believes are 4 possible constitutional grounds for a massive challenge to her conviction.
Yes, and this effort culminated in a highly significant formal action. On November 7, 2025, Lewis filed a detailed motion for post-conviction relief. This motion argues that the trial itself was fundamentally flawed because of constitutional violations related to the jury. We really need to look at these 4 allegations in depth, as they are the current legal frontline in this case.
Okay, let's break down the complex legal arguments in that 2025 motion. The first 2 allegations focus on procedural failures concerning the removal of one specific juror during the trial.
The first allegation, Violation 1, claims that the trial judge removed one of the 6 presiding jurors, even though the judge had previously deemed that juror competent to continue serving. Now, juror removal is a power the court holds, but it has to be exercised judiciously.
So if a judge finds a juror is competent, meaning they can remain impartial and follow instructions, removing them anyway without a compelling legal reason could be seen as an error.
A significant procedural error, yes. It could impinge on the defendant's right to a fair trial by the specific jury that was selected.
And the second allegation is about how that removal was done.
Yes, Violation 2 alleges that the judge removed this juror outside of Amanda Lewis's presence and without her approval. This is critical from a due process perspective. The defendant has an absolute right to be present at all critical stages of a criminal trial, especially those involving the composition of the jury that will decide their fate.
So if the judge did this in chambers without the defendant present, that's a serious problem.
It's cited in legal precedent as a fundamental procedural error. It undermines the basic fairness of the trial.
Okay, the third allegation then shifts focus entirely to a second juror and claims serious misconduct that could have compromised their impartiality.
Violation 3 involves highly prejudicial juror misconduct. The allegation is that the second juror failed to disclose that they had overheard the lead police officer on Lewis's case discussing the defendant in public, specifically at a grocery store. The claim states the officer falsely alleged that Lewis never should have had children because she was a drug addict.
Wow, that's an explosive claim. Jurors are sworn to impartiality and are specifically instructed not to seek or receive outside information. If a juror was exposed to that kind of damaging, non-evidentiary claim about the defendant's character from the lead investigator in the case, that juror's impartiality is immediately suspect.
The severity of that violation is immense. It suggests the jury deliberation may have been tainted by extraneous inflammatory information that came directly from a law enforcement official, and the juror's failure to disclose hearing it is a form of misconduct because it conceals a potential bias that could have influenced the final verdict.
And the final allegation is maybe the most shocking in terms of just basic legal requirements for jury duty.
Violation 4 alleges that the second juror, the one allegedly involved in the misconduct, was only 17 years old at the time of the trial.
17. The age requirement for jury service isn't nuance, it's fundamental law. A person has to be an adult, 18 or older, to be legally qualified to serve as a juror.
That's right. And if this allegation is proven true, it means the court fundamentally failed in the jury selection process. That individual was legally incapable of taking the sworn oath and rendering a binding verdict. That kind of procedural failure is severe enough, if proven, to cast a long shadow over the validity of the entire trial and verdict. So this collection of allegations from the November 2025 motion, they represent the current aggressive legal challenge to a conviction that's held for nearly 2 decades.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, who's trying to gain a clear understanding of this incredibly difficult case? We've covered a complicated timeline, balancing the tragic fact of Adrianna Hutto's death with the complex and often compromised legal process that followed.
Well, the source materials really present 2 highly competing narratives. The first one, which led to the conviction, it rested almost entirely on the powerful emotional testimony of a very young child, AJ, that was coupled with physical evidence, the bruises, that the prosecution argued corroborated the claim of foul play, and it led to a swift finding of guilt.
And the second narrative, the one that drives the ongoing legal challenge, focuses on all the procedural and evidentiary issues that undermine the certainty of that conviction. This includes the questionable reliability of a witness whose story changed, the compromised credibility of the medical examiner, Dr. Siebert, and now these recent very serious allegations of constitutional jury violations.
For you, the listener, this case serves as a stark demonstration of how a criminal conviction, even for a crime as serious as first-degree murder, can remain subject to intensive legal review years later. It shows that when the initial proceedings involve disputed procedures, like the selection and management of the jury, or when the credibility of expert witnesses is called into question, the judicial process isn't necessarily closed.
The knowledge application here is understanding that the legal system has to navigate this incredibly sensitive and delicate balance. There's the need for justice for the victim, Adrianna Hutto, versus the defendant's absolute right to a fair and constitutionally sound legal process. If that process itself was flawed, the conviction, regardless of perceived guilt, can't stand on firm legal ground.
Exactly. And the ongoing review underscores the critical need for transparency and integrity in the courtroom. So the final provocative thought for you to consider really centers on this crucial intersection of media investigation and the judicial system. We noted that intense, independent analysis by investigative journalists and specialized podcasts in 2024 and 2025 led directly to the formal legal action filed in November 2025. So the question is, What role does this increased public scrutiny, driven by non-traditional media, play in ensuring the necessary integrity, correcting past potential errors, and reinforcing the rule of law within our judicial process moving forward?
It certainly suggests that the pursuit of factual and procedural accuracy doesn't just stop once the courthouse doors close. We appreciate you joining us for this in-depth analysis of the sources surrounding the difficult and evolving case of Adrianna Hutto.
We hope this exploration helps you understand the full scope of this complicated situation and the legal avenues currently being pursued.
Thanks for listening.